If you can dance this waltz, I'll adopt you. Annie Bell felt every eye land on her at once. I'm little, Annie said, and though her voice was soft, it carried because no one dared interrupt her. I don't know how to dance like the ladies do. She glanced toward Noan. They all got pretty dresses, she said, swallowing. They belong out there. I don't. I'm just waiting for my mama. Near the side aisle, Lena Bell nearly dropped the silver tray in her hands. Annie, she whispered, her voice breaking before it had the chance to rise. Charles Whitmore took one measured step forward. You don't need a pretty dress, he said. He looked around the ballroom once, almost as if dismissing all the silk and diamonds in it with a glance, before returning his attention to Annie. You don't need lace. You don't need satin. You don't need anything glittering at all. If you can dance this waltz, that will be enough. Annie stared at him. At the rear of the room, Margaret Doyle, the banquet supervisor, stopped dead with folded linens in her arms and muttered, "Oh, Lord." Charles's gaze sharpened. I already told you, he said to Annie, quieter now. I saw your joints move with the music. Your feet knew the count. Your body answered the turn before anyone asked it to. A child doesn't do that unless the dance is already in her. Charles tilted his head. So, tell me the truth. Are you afraid? The question made the ballroom go still all over again. Annie lifted her chin. No, sir. No, he repeated. Then perhaps you only feel out of place. She nodded once. That can be fixed faster than fear. Lena finally stepped forward from the edge of the room. Mr. Whitmore, she's only a child, she said, her voice respectful, but tight with panic. She didn't mean to interrupt. I'm sorry. I'll take her. But Charles went on as though the entire room had narrowed down to one point between him and the little girl. What if I make you a promise? He asked Annie. The orchestra waited. The guests leaned in. Even Lena froze. Charles's expression remained calm, but his words were crafted to strike. If you can dance this dance, he said, I give you my word I will adopt you. Annie blinked. Charles's voice stayed cool, almost conversational, which only made it more unsettling. No one becomes a billionaire's daughter easily, he said. No one should. And who knows? If you truly have what I think you have, perhaps one day I may even leave you my fortune. Lena went pale. Sir, she began, but Annie was no longer looking at anyone except him. Her small fingers tightened at her sides. Why me? For the first time, Charles answered without cleverness. Because you heard the music with your bones, he said, and because everyone else in this room was watching the dancers while you were becoming one. Annie's heart beat so hard she could feel it in her throat. She looked toward the dance floor again. She looked at the women in elegant gowns. She looked at her own simple dress. She looked at the hands of her mother, still wrapped tight around a silver tray as if holding herself in place. I don't look like I belong there, Annie whispered. Charles extended one hand toward the center of the ballroom. Belonging does not come from a dress, he said. And courage does not ask permission from rich people. Then his tone hardened, just enough to challenge her pride. So I'll ask you one more time, Annie Bell. Are you afraid? Annie swallowed. No, sir. If you're not afraid, he said, then step up here and dance with me. Annie did not move. Charles kept his hand outstretched. Lena whispered, barely breathing now. Baby. Annie looked at her mother. Then Annie looked back at the billionaire. Annie's voice was soft. If I dance it, do you really mean it? Charles's expression did not soften, but it sharpened into something more serious. I do. Annie swallowed. You mean, I really get adopted? Charles did not look away from her. Yes, he said. Annie hesitated, then asked the question that mattered far more to her than silk. And my mama? She said. What happens to my mama? Lena, still near the edge of the room with a silver tray trembling in her hands, felt tears burn behind her eyes before she could stop them. Charles turned his head toward Lena briefly, then back to Annie. I will take care of your mother too, he said, plainly and without hesitation. She will be safe. She will be provided for. Annie searched his face with the solemn intensity only very young children and very old people seem to possess. You promise? He gave one slow nod. I promise. Annie glanced over at Lena. Mama? Annie whispered. Lena took one step forward, then another, ignoring the guests, the board members, and the staff, frozen near the walls. She stopped at the edge of the dance floor, close enough for Annie to see the strain around her mouth. Baby, Lena said softly. You don't have to do anything because somebody rich says so. Annie looked back at Charles. You said, Annie began slowly. That if I dance this one, the rest don't matter? Charles inclined his head. That is what I said. No dress? No dress. No fancy shoes? No fancy shoes. Annie's brow knit with the seriousness of a child trying to understand rules that had always been used against people like her. And I don't have to already know all the things those girls know. No, Charles said. Only the dance. The answer seemed to steady her and unsettle the room at the same time. A woman in silver silk near the donor tables murmured to the man beside her. This is becoming terribly inappropriate. Margaret Doyle, standing near the back with 2 folded tablecloths draped over one arm, muttered, It crossed that bridge 3 minutes ago. Charles ignored both voices. He bent just enough to be nearer Annie's height and said, more quietly now, Listen to me. If you can dance the waltz, the rest is not a problem. Not tonight. Not the dress. Not the room. Not the people watching. Just the dance. Annie breathed in. She looked down at her shoes, polished but worn, then at her mother, still in her service uniform, still holding a tray she had forgotten to set down. Annie's voice came out almost in a whisper. If I do it, Mama gets to stay with me? Charles answered without delay. Yes. And you'll help her too? Yes. You swear? Charles's gaze did not waver. I swear. If this moment touched your heart, please like this video. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of love, courage, and hope. Something in her small face changed. Not confidence exactly. Decision. All right, she said. The words were barely above a breath, but they landed with startling force. Charles lifted his hand slightly, inviting, not pulling. Annie gave a tiny nod. I'll do it. Charles stepped closer onto the shining center of the floor and said, Then come here. His voice was calm again, but now it carried certainty. Annie took one step. When she reached him, she stopped and lifted her face. You really won't be mad if I do it wrong? She asked. Charles answered at once. No. Even if I mess up? Even then. Annie glanced back at Lena one more time. Her mother stood rigid at the edge of the floor, torn between running forward and staying where she was. But when Annie found her eyes, Lena gave the smallest nod she could manage. The conductor looked toward Charles. Charles gave a slight nod. The first notes of the waltz rose again, softer than before. Charles bent carefully, adjusting himself to Annie's height, one hand prepared to guide, not overpower. He lowered his voice so only she could hear the next words. Just listen to the count, he said. Nothing else matters. Braced. Annie nodded. 1, 2, 3. The music opened like a path before her. The first step was small enough to miss if anyone had blinked. The second was not. Annie felt the count before she trusted it. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Charles Whitmore's hand remained steady around hers. Not pulling. Not rushing. Simply there for her to follow if she chose to. The ballroom watched for hesitation. For embarrassment. For the awkward little collapse people expected when a child from the wrong side of a service door was asked to stand in the center of a room built for wealth. But Annie did not collapse. She listened. That was what made the difference. She was not thinking about the chandeliers now. Not about the satin dresses, the black tuxedos, or the faces staring at her with curiosity too polished to be called rude. She was thinking about the music and the way it moved in circles, how it asked her body to lean, then turn, then breathe. Charles adjusted to her height with surprising care. He shortened his stride, softened his frame, and guided her through the opening turn. Annie followed once, then again, and by the third measure something inside her loosened. The fear did not vanish. It simply lost the right to lead. A murmur passed through the ballroom, then died just as quickly. Annie's steps were not those of a trained society child. There was no practiced show in them, no pageant smile, no rehearsed awareness of where the audience sat. What she had instead was instinct. Her small ankles caught the rhythm cleanly. Her shoulders softened where they should. Her timing, once she found it, settled into the music as though she had known this dance long before she had ever seen it named. Charles noticed first what others noticed second. She did not watch the room. She listened to the count and trusted it. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. The orchestra, sensing something unusual, began to play more carefully. The musicians were no longer filling air for donors who barely heard them. They were accompanying a moment that had become larger than entertainment. At the edge of the floor, Lena stood perfectly still, She had set the tray down without remembering when. Her hands were empty now, open at her sides, fingers curled slightly as if they wanted to reach out and could not. Her heart was beating so hard it made her feel lightheaded. She did not trust Charles Whitmore. She did not trust public promises, rich men, or rooms where people applauded before they understood what they were applauding. But she trusted what she saw in her daughter. Annie was not being carried. She was dancing. Margaret Doyle came to stand beside her, arms folded across her middle. "She's got it," she said quietly. Lena's eyes did not leave the floor. "I know." Margaret glanced at her. "That doesn't sound like comfort." "It's not." Across the ballroom, Helena Price had stopped pretending this was charming. Her smile had faded into something narrower. Victor Hale, standing a few paces behind her, was already watching not Annie's feet but the room itself. Measuring reactions, collecting angles, calculating value, that was how people like him survived. They never simply looked at a moment. They sized it. Annie made another turn, this one cleaner than the last. A few people leaned forward. A woman near the orchestra lowered her glass. A man at the donor table stopped whispering midway through a sentence. One of the servers by the rear wall smiled before quickly schooling his face again. Charles led Annie through a gentle cross-step and felt her catch the change almost immediately. He had spent enough time in rooms like this to know when applause was mere politeness. This was not politeness gathering now. It was surprise becoming respect. He looked down at her. Her face was serious, almost solemn. She was not dazzled by him, not charmed by the room. She was concentrating with the kind of honesty adults often lost before they reached 30. Something tightened in his chest. He did not like surprises, especially emotional ones. Yet here he was, standing beneath chandeliers in front of donors, society, women, board members, cameras, and staff, guiding a 6-year-old girl through a waltz and feeling, against his nature, that the room had become less false because she was in it. The music rose slightly, and Annie answered it with her first natural turn. It was not perfect. It was better than perfect. It was true. A breath seemed to leave the room all at once. Lena pressed a hand to her mouth. Margaret whispered, "Lord." Annie came back into place facing Charles, her small chest rising and falling with effort, but her feet still under her. She looked up at him only once, just enough to make sure he was still there, then returned to the music. That glance did something to him he could not have explained and would not have appreciated being asked to. The final phrase began. Charles slowed slightly so she would not lose the ending. Annie followed. One step, then another. Then, the turn into stillness. When the last note fell, Charles released her hand. For a brief second, the ballroom held its breath. Then the applause came. Not neat, not restrained, not social, real. Annie startled at the sound. Her eyes widened, and for the first time all evening she looked her age again. She turned toward her mother as if to ask what had just happened. Lena was already moving. She crossed the edge of the floor in quick steps and dropped to one knee beside Annie, gathering her close without caring who watched. Annie leaned into her at once. "Mama," she whispered, breathless. Lena cupped her face. "Yes, baby, you did. Did I do it right?" Lena's throat tightened. "You did it beautiful." Charles stood beside them, silent for a moment, while the applause faded into murmurs and whispers all around the room. He looked neither triumphant nor pleased with himself. If anything, he looked disturbed by the fact that he had not been wrong. Victor Hale approached first, because men like Victor always did. "That was extraordinary," he said smoothly, his smile polished for public use. "Charles, the board will want to discuss next steps carefully. Press has already heard something happened in here." Lena rose slowly, keeping one hand on Annie's shoulder. "There won't be any next steps tonight." Victor turned to her with a courteous expression that did not reach his eyes. "Mrs. Bell, I'm sure everyone wants what is best for your daughter." Lena met his gaze. "People say that a lot right before they stop asking mothers what they think." Victor's smile held, though barely. Charles spared him a glance. "Not now, Victor. That was enough." Victor stepped back, though not far. The room had begun to rearrange itself. Guests who would never have spoken to Lena an hour ago now looked at her with new interest. Some with admiration, some with curiosity, some with the calculating look of people wondering how a miracle might fit into a foundation brochure. Helena Price approached with careful grace, her gown whispering over the floor. "Well," she said, smiling at Annie in a way that managed to feel both warm and distant. What an unexpected little star. Annie moved closer to Lena. Helena's attention shifted to Charles. A touching moment, certainly. Though I assume no one is taking dramatic language too literally. The meaning was clear enough. Charles turned toward her fully. I don't speak carelessly. The answer landed harder than his volume suggested. Helena paused. Charles, surely you understand the legal and social implications of statements made in public. I do. And yet, I said. Charles replied, still calm, that I do. Silence widened around them. People were no longer pretending not to listen. Lena felt Annie's hand slip into hers. A worse fear took hold then, sharper than the fear of public humiliation. If Charles meant what he had said, this was not a strange moment that would fade by midnight. It was a door opening onto something vast, dangerous, and impossible to control. She wanted to leave. She wanted to run. She wanted to gather Annie and get back to the service hallway. The bus stop. Their apartment. Their real life. Where promises did not come dressed in tuxedos and chandelier light. But Annie looked up at Charles with serious eyes and asked the question only she would think to ask in a room like this. So, I did it? Charles looked at her, and for the first time there was no performance left in his face. Yes, he said. Annie hesitated. Then you meant the promise? A few people shifted uncomfortably. Helena's expression cooled. Victor looked at Charles with sharp new attention. Charles did not look away. Yes, he said again. I meant it. Lena drew in a breath. Mr. Whitmore, he turned to her. I would like to speak with you and your daughter privately when this event ends. Lena's chin lifted. About what? About what happens next. There it was. Simple. Controlled. Irrevocable. Around them, the ballroom had resumed breathing, but not normally. The atmosphere had changed. Staff moved more carefully. Guests whispered more quietly. The orchestra members kept their eyes lowered while pretending to reorder music sheets. Everyone understood that the dance had been one thing. What came after would be another. Annie looked from Charles to her mother, sensing the weight in both faces even if she could not yet name it. The applause was gone now. The room had returned to wealth, manners, and consequence. And standing in the middle of it, in her plain blue dress and worn shoes, Annie Bell understood only one thing for certain. The music had stopped, but her life had not. By the time the last guests drifted back toward their tables, Lena's pulse had not settled. She stood with Annie beside the ballroom wall, while servers resumed their careful movement around the room. Glasses were replaced. Plates were cleared. The orchestra lowered its instruments and began turning pages for the next segment of the program, as if the evening had not just tilted off its axis. But nothing felt normal anymore. Not the chandeliers, not the donors, not the smiles. Annie leaned lightly against Lena's side, still warm from the dance. Still quiet in that thoughtful way she had when something too large for words had entered her world. Are we in trouble? Annie asked. Lena looked down at her daughter's face and forced herself to soften. No, baby. Annie studied her. You said that fast. Lena brushed one thumb over her cheek. That doesn't mean it isn't true. Across the room, Charles Whitmore had become surrounded again. Board members, donors, and two men Lena recognized from local television all seemed to feel entitled to his attention. But he gave them less than they wanted. His posture remained controlled, his answers short. Twice Lena saw Victor Hale lean in with the polished urgency of a man trying to guide the shape of an unfolding crisis. Twice Charles dismissed him with a look or a few low words. That, more than the promise itself, unsettled her. Rich men often said reckless things. Fewer stood by them when the room grew complicated. Margaret Doyle came up beside them carrying Annie's little cardigan over one arm. You all right? She asked Lena. No. That sounds more honest. Lena exhaled. I need this shift. You still have it. For now. Margaret glanced toward Charles. He asked to speak with you after the program? Lena nodded. Margaret's face tightened. Then speak standing up. Lena gave her a tired look. Wasn't planning to kneel. Good. Too many folks in rooms like this mistake exhaustion for agreement. Annie looked from one woman to the other. Mama, is he really going to talk to us? Yes. Is that bad? Lena opened her mouth, then closed it again. It depends on whether he remembers you're a child and I'm your mother. Margaret handed Annie the cardigan. Put this on, sweetheart. Big rooms always get colder after pretty things happen. Annie obeyed, slipping her arms into the sleeves. Miss Margaret. Yes, honey? If somebody promises something in a room full of people, do they have to mean it? Margaret's eyes flicked to Lena before returning to Annie. Decent people do. The word decent stayed with Lena. She had spent years around people who knew how to appear respectable. That was not the same thing. When the formal part of the gala ended, guests began moving toward dessert stations and smaller clusters of conversation. The pressure in the room shifted from spectacle to gossip. Lena could feel it passing near her in fragments. That's the child. He actually said adopt. Surely he didn't mean it literally. Can you imagine? What will the press do with this? Annie heard some of it too. She pressed closer to Lena but said nothing. Then Charles crossed the floor toward them. The crowd parted for him almost without realizing it. That was another thing wealth did well. It trained other people's bodies before it ever needed their loyalty. Victor Hale followed half a step behind, carrying a tablet in one hand and discretion in the other. Charles stopped in front of Lena and Annie. Ms. Bell. The way he said it plainly, without condescension, did not relax her. Mr. Whitmore. His eyes moved briefly to Annie. Would you and your daughter come with me? Somewhere quieter. Victor added smoothly. Only for a few minutes. We've arranged a private sitting room just off the west corridor. Lena looked at Victor, then back at Charles. My daughter does not go anywhere without me. She would not, Charles said. That wasn't the whole sentence. Something flickered in Victor's face. Not anger. Annoyance that the conversation was refusing to become easy. Charles seemed to understand at once. You both come, he said. Or neither of you does. Lena held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. The sitting room was smaller than she expected. Not intimate exactly, but insulated. Heavy curtains softened the sound from the ballroom. A lamp glowed near a leather sofa. There was a tray of untouched coffee, sugar cubes, and water glasses set out with the kind of thoughtfulness that belonged more to hotel staff than to billionaires. Annie noticed the cookies first but did not ask for one. Lena remained standing. Charles stayed standing too. Victor closed the door, then took up position near the sideboard. Margaret had followed as far as the hall and now lingered just beyond the partly open threshold on the pretense of directing banquet staff. Lena noticed and was grateful. Charles began without ceremony. What I said tonight was public, he said. So I will not insult you by pretending it was casual. No, Lena replied. You won't. He accepted that. I meant it. Lena's laugh was short and without humor. That phrase keeps sounding different every time you say it. Annie looked between them. You said if I danced, you'd adopt me. Charles turned toward her. I did, and help my mama. Yes. Lena stepped slightly in front of Annie. Before this goes any further, let's be clear about one thing. My child is not a prize, a project, or a story to improve your image. Victor spoke then, too quickly. No one is suggesting that. Lena turned her head toward him. I wasn't speaking to you. Silence followed. Charles seemed almost to approve of it. Miss Bell, he said. I understand your suspicion. No, Lena said evenly. You understand that I have it. That's not the same thing. Annie looked up at her mother, then at Charles again. If he adopts me, do I have to leave you? There it was. The real wound. The question beneath every other question. Charles did not answer right away, which at least told Lena he knew better than to lie quickly. No, he said at last. Not unless something legal, safe, and agreed upon ever required a different arrangement, and nothing would happen without discussion. That sounds like lawyer talk, Lena said. Victor opened his mouth, but Charles lifted a hand, stopping him. It is lawyer talk, Charles said. Because reckless promises become dangerous if they stay reckless. I'm telling you, there are lawful ways to protect Annie, support her, and provide security for both of you without taking her from you tonight. Or tomorrow. Annie frowned. So, not tonight? No, Charles said gently. Not tonight. She thought about that. But you still mean it? Yes. Lena watched him closely. His face remained calm. But calm was not innocence. Calm could be control. Calm could be practiced. Still, she had expected evasion by now. Some graceful retreat. Some polished explanation of how tonight had been symbolic. He had not taken it. Why? She asked. Charles looked at Annie before answering. Because she has a gift. Lena's jaw tightened. A gift is not a reason to take a child. No, he said. It is a reason not to leave her where the world will crush it for lack of money. The words hit too close to something true. And Lena hated that. My daughter is not being crushed. I did not say by you. Victor shifted his weight, sensing the conversation turning too honest for his comfort. Charles. Perhaps it would be wiser to frame this as scholarship support to begin with. Training, housing assistance, a family advancement package. Something structured. Lena looked sharply at him. A package? Victor's tone remained smooth. I mean, support. You mean language that sounds clean enough to print. Charles's eyes flicked toward Victor. Leave us. Victor blinked. Excuse me. I said leave us. For the first time that evening, Victor's mask slipped. Not much, but enough. He set the tablet down, nodded stiffly, and left the room, closing the door behind him. The silence afterward felt better. Charles looked at Annie again. How old are you? 6. And do you know what adoption means? Annie considered. It means somebody picks you to be their child. Lena's eyes stung at the simplicity of it. Charles crouched then, bringing himself nearer Annie's height, and somehow that altered the room more than anything else he had done. It should mean more than that, he said. It should mean responsibility, safety, a promise that does not disappear when the music does. Annie was quiet for a long moment. And you'd help Mama too? Yes. Really help? Yes, 'cause she gets tired. Something changed in Charles's face then. Something small and controlled but unmistakably human. I know, he said. Lena crossed her arms. Do you? He rose slowly. Enough to know this conversation cannot be finished tonight. That, finally, sounded sensible. He moved to the small writing desk near the lamp, took a card from a silver case, and wrote a second number on the back by hand. This is my direct line, he said, offering it to Lena. And this is the number for Judge Raymond Mercer, who advises me on family and charitable legal matters. Speak to no one else before you choose whether to speak to me again. Lena did not take the card immediately. Choose. Yes, Charles said. You will decide whether this continues. Not Victor, not the board, not the newspapers. That surprised her enough to show. Annie looked up. So we can say no? Charles met her eyes. Yes. Lena took the card at last. She did not thank him. He did not seem to expect it. Outside the room, the ballroom music had started again, thinner now through the walls, as if the night were trying to return to itself and failing. Annie slipped her hand into Lena's. Are we going home? She asked. Lena looked down at the card in her palm, then at the man who had changed the shape of her child's life with one sentence and had not yet taken it back. Yes, she said, but as she turned toward the door, she understood with a tightening in her chest that home, after tonight, might no longer feel as simple as it had that morning. The bus ride home was quieter than usual. Annie sat by the window with her cardigan buttoned wrong and her small hands folded in her lap, as if she were afraid one more movement might disturb whatever had followed them out of the hotel. Lena sat beside her with Charles Whitmore's card inside her purse, where it seemed to weigh more than her wallet, her keys, and the week's grocery receipts combined. Outside, the city slid past in streaks of wet light and tired brick. A liquor store sign blinked red over the corner. A man in a work jacket stood under a pharmacy awning smoking in the cold. 2 teenage boys laughed too loudly near a bus stop bench. Nothing in the street looked changed. That almost made it worse. Annie pressed her forehead lightly to the glass. Do you think rich people always talk like that? Lena kept her eyes ahead. Like what? Like everything they say can make a door open. Lena let out a breath through her nose. Some do. Can they always? No. She paused. But people around them often act like they can. Annie was quiet for a moment. He said I could say no. Lena turned then and studied her daughter's face in the reflected bus light. Yes. Could I? Lena reached over and fixed the top button of Annie's cardigan. Yes, baby. You could. Annie accepted the answer, though not fully. Children often knew when adults were telling the truth in principle, instead of in practice. By the time they reached their building, the wind had sharpened. Lena held Annie's hand tighter than usual as they climbed the stairs to the second-floor apartment. The hallway smelled faintly of old radiator heat, fried onions from someone's late dinner, and the bleach the landlord used near the mailboxes when he remembered to. It was not much, but it was theirs. Inside, Lena turned on the lamp by the sofa and set her purse down without taking off her coat. Their apartment looked exactly as it had that morning. 2 mismatched kitchen chairs, a narrow couch with a folded blanket over one arm, Annie's crayons in a chipped mug near the window, and the old radio on the counter that sometimes worked better if you tapped it twice on the side. The ordinary sight of it should have calmed her. Instead, It made the hotel ballroom feel even more dangerous, as though something impossible had come too close to touching the life she had spent years holding together by her fingertips. Annie sat on the couch and kicked off her shoes. Mama? E.D. Yes. If I got adopted, would I have a different last name? Lena closed her eyes for half a second. We are not deciding anything tonight. That's not what I asked. Children were merciless with truth. Lena took off her coat and hung it over the chair by the door. Maybe, she said finally. Sometimes, Annie frowned. I like Belle. So do I. Annie looked relieved by that. Then she asked the harder question. Would you still be my mama? Lena crossed the room and sat beside her. She drew Annie close, wrapping one arm around her shoulders. Listen to me. No matter what any rich man says in a ballroom, I am your mother. That does not change because someone makes a promise in public. Annie leaned into her. Okay, but Lena could feel the child still thinking. She got Annie changed, warmed a small pot of canned soup, and set crackers on a plate between them. Annie ate slowly, more tired than hungry. The little girl's face had the faraway look it always did when her mind was trying to carry more than her age should require. After dinner, while Lena washed the bowls, Annie sat at the kitchen table and drew circles on a scrap of paper with a blue crayon. Round and round, not flowers, not faces, just circles. What are those? Lena asked. Turns. Lena dried her hands and looked at the page. You remember them already? Annie nodded. My feet do. That should have been a sweet thing. Instead, it made Lena grip the dish towel tighter. Later, after Annie was asleep under the faded quilt in the bedroom alcove, Lena took Charles Whitmore's card out of her purse and laid it on the table. The heavy cream paper looked strange among the overdue electric bill, a pharmacy receipt, and a school notice about winter supplies. She stared at his name for a long time. Then she picked up the card, turned it over, and looked at the second number he had written by hand. Judge Raymond Mercer. Lena did not call that night. She barely slept. At 5:30 the next morning, the radiator clanged awake and dragged the apartment into another workday. Lena got dressed in the half-dark, tied her hair back, packed Annie's lunch, and tried not to think about the card. By 6:30, she was walking Annie downstairs to Mrs. Alvarez in 1B, who agreed to watch her before school for $5 less than she usually charged because, as she put it, that child says thank you with both eyes. Lena took the early bus to the hotel. The Ashcroft Grand looked different in daylight, less magical, more expensive. Delivery trucks lined the alley. Kitchen staff smoked in winter coats by the loading entrance. Men in maintenance uniforms rolled carts across the service ramp. The ballroom where the previous night had turned strange now sat somewhere above her, probably quiet except for vacuum cleaners and banquet crews stripping tablecloths. Margaret Doyle was already in the back office with a clipboard and a cup of coffee when Lena arrived. You look terrible, Margaret said. Good morning to you too. Margaret handed her the coffee without being asked. Drink that before you faint dramatic. Lena accepted it. I'm not dramatic. No, honey. You're exhausted. Different thing. For a moment, neither woman mentioned the gala. That almost made the silence tender. Then Margaret leaned back in her chair. He call yet? No. You going to call him? Lena took a sip of the coffee. It was terrible and hot, and exactly what she needed. I don't know. Margaret nodded as if she had expected nothing else. That means you're thinking about it. I'm thinking about rent, groceries, bus fare. A 6-year-old asking me whether she'll still be my child if somebody richer wants her. Margaret's eyes softened. I know. Lena looked down into her cup. I hate that some part of me even has to consider it. Considering help isn't the same as selling your soul. That depends who's offering. Before Margaret could answer, 2 younger banquet workers walked past the office door whispering. One of them glanced in and then quickly away. Lena felt it immediately. The room had shifted around her. By mid-morning, everyone knew. Not the whole story, of course. Hotels were like towns trapped inside buildings. Facts rarely traveled without costume jewelry, but enough had spread. People stared a little too long. A dishwasher in the employee cafeteria asked if Annie was the little girl from the ballroom. A line cook said he'd heard Mr. Whitmore was going to put the child in private school. Someone else claimed the local paper had called asking questions. Lena kept working. She remade coffee stations, stripped linen from banquet tables, and hauled bags of folded napkins to storage, while pretending her life had not become hallway talk. It was humiliating, but it was also familiar. Poor people often learn the hardest version of privacy. Everyone could discuss your trouble, but very few could change it. At noon, her supervisor, Denise Carver, called her into the operations office. Denise was a woman in her 50s with tired shoulders and a face that had once been pretty in a way the years had sharpened instead of erased. She was not cruel. In places like this, that counted for something. Denise closed the office door behind Lena and gestured to the chair. "Sit." Lena stayed standing. "I'm fine." Denise gave her a look. "You are not fine." Lena said nothing. Denise opened a folder, glanced at something inside, then closed it again. Corporate got a phone call this morning. So did the general manager. Someone from a local society page wants comment on what happened last night. Lena's stomach tightened. "I didn't talk to anybody." "I know. Then why am I in here?" "Because the hotel likes calm more than truth." Denise folded her hands. "And because whenever wealthy people do something unpredictable, workers near the scene become a risk." "There it was," cleanly said. Lena lifted her chin. "Are you firing me?" "No." Denise held her gaze. "Not today." The "not today" settled between them like bad weather. "But I am moving you off visible banquet assignments for a few days," Denise continued. "Housekeeping overflow. Back floors. Less guest contact." Humiliation burned hot under Lena's skin. "So I'm being hidden. I'm trying to keep you employed." Lena laughed once, without amusement. "That's how they always dress it up." Denise's expression tightened. "Don't mistake realism for cruelty. I'm giving you space before this turns uglier." Lena wanted to be angry with her. The truth was, she understood exactly what Denise meant. When she came out of the office, Margaret was waiting near the linen carts. "Well?" "Not fired." Margaret studied her face. But moved where nobody has to look at me." Margaret muttered something under her breath that was probably prayer-shaped like profanity. Lena worked the afternoon on the 12th floor, changing sheets in empty suites and wiping down bathroom counters while trying not to imagine people downstairs discussing her child like a headline with curls. The rooms were large, tasteful, and impersonal. King beds, marble sinks, heavy drapes, art no one actually looked at. She made everything neat for people whose lives would never depend on neatness the way hers did. Around 3, her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. A text from Mrs. Alvarez. "Annie says the music from last night is still in her head. She asked if rich men keep promises. I told her that depends on whether they've ever had to keep one before." Lena read the message twice. Then she sat down on the edge of an untouched hotel bed and, for the first time since the gala, let herself feel what she had been pushing away. Hope, not trust. Certainly not surrender. But hope, thin and dangerous, moving through her like something she had not given herself permission to carry in years. That frightened her more than anything else. Because hope made people negotiate with things they should refuse. Hope made hard women answer private numbers. Hope made mothers wonder whether one impossible promise might actually open a door. At the end of her shift, Lena stood alone in the service stairwell with Charles Whitmore's card in one hand and her phone in the other. She looked at his name, then at Judge Mercer's, then back again. Above her, somewhere in the hotel, silverware clattered and a vacuum cleaner roared across a ballroom floor that no longer belonged only to the rich in her mind. Annie had touched it. Annie had changed it. That mattered, whether Charles Whitmore proved worthy of the moment or not. Lena took a slow breath. Then, before fear could turn itself into pride, she pressed the number he had written by hand. Judge Raymond Mercer did not sound like a man who enjoyed being surprised. He answered on the 4th ring with a voice that was deep, measured, and a little tired. The kind of voice that suggested old courtrooms, long days, and too many people lying politely in his presence. "Mercer." Lena tightened her grip on the phone. "My name is Lena Bell. Mr. Whitmore gave me your number." There was the slightest pause. "I wondered if you might call," he said. "Are you somewhere you can speak freely?" Lena looked around the service stairwell. Concrete walls, metal railings, the smell of dust and industrial cleaner. No one nearby except the throb of hotel machinery and distant footsteps. "Yes, all right. Then let me begin with something simple. I do not work for newspapers, donors, or Mr. Whitmore's public relations staff. If I speak with you, I speak as counsel regarding what is lawful, what is not, and what would protect your child." Lena leaned back against the wall. That would be a nice change. Mercer seemed to understand the answer without taking offense. "You sound tired, Miss Bell." "I am, and suspicious." "Yes, that sounds healthier." For the first time that day, Lena almost smiled. Mercer asked her to describe, in her own words, exactly what had happened in the ballroom and everything Charles had said afterward. He did not interrupt often. When he did, it was only to clarify. Was Annie touched or pressured? Were there witnesses? Was there any written offer? Did anyone suggest immediate removal of the child from the mother? Did Victor Hale speak directly of press strategy? Did Charles retreat from his public promise once the room changed? Lena answered carefully. By the time she finished, her break had gone cold around her, and the muscles between her shoulders hurt. Mercer was quiet for a moment. What Mr. Whitmore said publicly was reckless. I know, but not meaningless, he added. That is what complicates this. Lena closed her eyes. I don't need complicated. I need to know whether a rich man can decide my daughter's future. Because he liked the way she moved to music. He cannot, Mercer said. Not lawfully, not ethically, not without your consent and significant process. Quote, the words eased something in her chest. But, he continued, he can offer support. Educational sponsorship, housing assistance, medical support, training, trust protections. Eventually, if relationships developed, and if you wished it, there are lawful discussions that could become more permanent, but none of that happens because of one sentence in a ballroom. Lena let out a breath. Then why did he say it like that? Mercer's answer came without hesitation. Because men like Charles Whitmore spend too much of their lives being obeyed before they have fully thought. That made her trust him a little. When the call ended, Mercer gave her one final piece of advice. Do not speak to the press. Do not sign anything quickly. And if Mr. Whitmore wishes to continue this conversation, insist that every practical matter begin with your daughter's safety and your parental rights, not his emotions. When Lena returned to work, she carried those words like a folded note in her pocket. By the time her shift ended, dusk had already settled over the city. The bus home was crowded with people wearing the day on their faces, cashiers, home health aides, stock clerks, men in paint-spattered work boots, women staring into space with grocery bags between their knees. Lena stood for most of the ride, one hand gripping the rail, Charles Whitmore's card warm in her coat pocket. At home, Annie was sitting cross-legged on the floor near the radio, drawing circles again. Hi, Mama. Lena bent to kiss the top of her head. Hi, baby. Mrs. Alvarez, gathering her purse from the chair by the door, smiled softly. She ate her sandwich, did her spelling, and asked me 3 times whether judges are mean. Annie looked up. Are they? Lena slipped off her coat. Some are. Mrs. Alvarez chuckled. That is the most honest answer I've heard all week. She squeezed Lena's arm on her way out. Try to sleep tonight. Lena waited until the door closed behind her, then went into the kitchen and turned on the small stove burner under a pot of leftover beans. The apartment smelled of onion, radiator heat, and laundry soap. Ordinary things, good things, things that belonged to a life no one glamorous had ever noticed until now. Annie followed her into the kitchen. Did you call the judge? Lena glanced down. Yes. What did he say? That nobody gets to take you from me because of one dance. Annie nodded, absorbing that. Did he say the rich man was telling the truth? Lena stirred the pot slowly. He said the rich man was serious. Annie seemed to file that away as a separate category. Serious was not the same as good. Children understood distinctions, adults often blurred. That night, after dinner, while Lena folded towels still warm from the laundromat dryer, the phone rang. Not her cell phone, the apartment line. Very few people used it anymore. For a second, she only stared at it. Then she picked up. Hello? Miss Bell. Charles Whitmore's voice was unmistakable, even stripped of ballroom echo. Calm. Controlled. Too exact to be accidental. Thank you for calling Judge Mercer. He informed me you had spoken. Lena leaned against the counter. Annie, in the living room, was humming under her breath as she lined up crayons by color. I called because I prefer facts to spectacle, Lena said. A sensible preference. She waited. Charles did not fill silence the way ordinary men did. He used it as if it belonged to him. Finally, he said, I would like to meet tomorrow afternoon. Not at the hotel. Not publicly. You may bring anyone you trust. Lena's eyes narrowed, though he could not see it. Why? To discuss concrete terms of support. Schooling. Dance instruction. Housing stability, if needed. And because it is clear you will not tolerate vague promises. No, she said. I won't. Good. She almost hated that she respected the answer. Where? She asked. My office is attached to the Whitmore Foundation building downtown, he said. But if that feels too formal, we can meet in the community art studio we sponsor on Madison Street. Public enough to reassure you. Private enough to talk. The fact that he offered the second option without her forcing it surprised her. The studio, she said. At 4 o'clock. Lena looked toward Annie, who was now spinning one crayon between her fingers as if it were a baton. I'm bringing my daughter. I assumed you would, and this is not an agreement. I know. She hesitated, then asked the question that had needled her all day. Mr. Whitmore? Why Annie? There was no immediate answer. When it came, it was quieter. Because some people enter a room asking what it can give them, he said. Your daughter entered one listening for music. A pause. And because gifts like hers are too often left to die where the wealthy never have to watch. The answer unsettled her because it sounded thought out, not merely charming. When she hung up, Annie was already watching her. That was him. Yes. Are we going somewhere tomorrow? Lena nodded once. To talk. About me? Yes. Annie considered that. Can I wear the blue dress again? Lena almost said no. The dress had become too tied to that night. Too full of strange light and strange promises. But Annie asked it so simply that refusing felt like fear pretending to be wisdom. If you want. Annie smiled faintly and returned to her crayons. The next afternoon, Lena took extra care getting ready, though she would have denied it if anyone had asked. She pressed Annie's blue dress again, fixed the ribbons in her braids, and chose her own cleanest dark slacks with a cream blouse she usually saved for church and school meetings. She wore no jewelry except the tiny gold cross her mother had left her years ago. The Madison Street Art Studio sat between a pharmacy and a hardware store in a part of downtown that had not decided whether it was rising or falling. Its front windows displayed student paintings, flyers for youth classes, and a faded poster about music therapy. That reassured Lena more than marble offices would have. Inside, the studio smelled faintly of dust, old wood, and acrylic paint. Folding chairs lined one wall. A piano stood in the far corner. Mirrors reflected the late afternoon light. It was beautiful in a practical way, built for use rather than display. Charles Whitmore was already there. He was not wearing a tuxedo now, just a charcoal suit, no tie. White shirt open at the collar. It should have made him seem more ordinary. It did not. Some men carried power like cologne. It stayed on them no matter what they wore. Judge Mercer stood with him, older than Lena expected, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, with the unhurried steadiness of a man who had spent years deciding which facts mattered and which performances did not. That alone calmed her. Miss Bell, Mercer said. Annie. Annie gave a polite little nod. Hello. Charles looked at the child first. Hello, Annie. She held his gaze a second longer than most adults in expensive rooms had managed. Then Charles looked at Lena. Thank you for coming. Lena remained standing near the door, Annie's hand in hers. We came to listen. That is enough, he said. Mercer gestured toward the chairs set in a loose circle near the mirrors. Then let us begin with what matters most. And as Lena moved deeper into the room with her daughter beside her, she understood that the dance had carried them farther than a ballroom floor ever should have been able to do. Judge Mercer did not begin with Charles. He began with Lena. That is where this conversation should begin, he said, taking a seat but leaving space so it did not feel like a courtroom. Miss Bell, before anyone discusses schools, money, or legal structures, I want to ask you a simple question. What do you want for your daughter? Lena did not sit right away. She rested one hand on the back of a folding chair, the other still holding Annie's hand. I want her safe, she said. I want her educated. I want her gift to have a chance. And I don't want her turned into a story people tell to feel good about themselves. Mercer nodded slowly. Those are reasonable things to want. Charles remained quiet, listening. Mercer turned to Annie. And what do you want, Annie? Annie looked at the mirrors first, then at the piano, then back at the adults. She took her time, which made Mercer watch her more carefully. I want to dance, she said, and I want my mama not to be tired all the time. No one spoke for a moment after that. Mercer leaned back slightly. All right, then we will speak plainly. He folded his hands. Mr. Whitmore cannot simply adopt you because of a promise made at a gala. That is not how the law works, and it is not how it should work. But he can do something else. He can sponsor Annie's education. He can pay for proper dance training. He can ensure housing stability so you are not one emergency away from losing everything. All of that can be done legally without taking Annie away from you. Lena finally sat down. And what does he get? She asked. Charles answered this time. Nothing that can be written into a contract. That's not how rich men usually operate. No, he said. It isn't. Mercer watched both of them carefully. What he gets, Mercer said, if this is done properly, is the responsibility he publicly claimed to want. Lena looked at Charles. Responsibility is a heavy word to say in a ballroom. It's heavier in real life. I know, Charles said. You don't, she replied quietly. Not the way we mean it. He did not argue with her. Mercer opened a folder he had brought and slid a paper across the table. This is a preliminary structure. Not adoption, not custody, sponsorship and educational trust. Funds that can only be used for Annie's schooling, training, medical care, and housing support for the household she lives in with you. The money cannot be taken back on a whim. It cannot be used to control you, and it cannot be accessed by anyone except for Annie's benefit. Lena did not touch the paper yet. People don't give that kind of money without wanting something, she said. Charles spoke quietly. You're right. So what do you want? He held her gaze. I want to make sure what I saw on that floor does not disappear because of money. That still sounds like something you want, Lena said. Yes, he said. It is. Annie, who had been very quiet, spoke then. If he helps me dance, do I have to live in his house? All three adults looked at her. No, Charles said. Do I have to call you Dad? The question landed harder than the others. Charles answered carefully. No. Then what would I call you? He thought for a moment. You may call me Charles, or Mr. Whitmore, or nothing at all if you're angry with me. That made Mercer hide the beginning of a smile. Annie seemed satisfied with that answer. She slid her hand along the edge of the chair, then asked the question that mattered most to her. Are you really going to help my mama? Charles looked at Lena before answering Annie. Yes. Lena crossed her arms. Help how? First, he said, stable housing. If you wish to move somewhere safer or closer to Annie's school and training, I will cover it through the trust so it is not a personal gift. Second, education or training if you want a different position than hotel night shifts. Third, legal protection so no one can exploit Annie's image or story without your consent. Lena studied him. You already thought about this? Yes. Before the dance? No, he said. After. That answer mattered. Mercer nodded slightly, as if noting the distinction. Mr. Whitmore called me this morning, Mercer said. That is why I am here. Lena looked between them. So this is real? Yes, Mercer said. But real things still require caution. Annie slid off her chair and walked slowly toward the mirrors. She looked at herself in the blue dress, at her shoes, at the room behind her reflected in the glass. Then she turned and said, very seriously, if I learn to dance better, I can dance on big stages? Charles answered, yes. And make money? Yes. And buy my mama a house so she doesn't have to clean floors? Lena felt her throat close. Charles did not smile when he answered. Yes. Annie nodded once, as if confirming a private plan. Then she walked back and climbed onto the chair again. Mercer leaned forward. There is another matter we must address now, before it becomes a problem later. Lena looked at him. What? The press, Mercer said. And the donor board. Charles's jaw tightened slightly. Victor is already trying to manage it. Lena frowned. Manage what? The story, Charles said. They want to present this as a charity narrative. A heartwarming story. The billionaire who rescues the poor child. Lena's face went cold. No. I know, he said. I am not letting my daughter be turned into something people clap for and then forget. You won't have to, Charles said. Mercer looked at him. That will cost you. Charles did not look away. I know. Lena watched him carefully then, searching for hesitation, for calculation, for the moment when this would all begin to sound like too much trouble for a man who could return to a life of easier philanthropy and safer stories. But he did not retreat. Instead, he said something that changed the air in the room. When Annie stood on that floor, he said quietly, everyone in that ballroom thought the test was whether she could dance. They were wrong. The test was whether the adults in that room deserved to watch her. No one spoke after that for several seconds. Mercer nodded once, slowly. That is the first intelligent thing I've heard anyone say about this situation. Lena looked down at her hands. They were rough from chemicals and hot water and years of work no one applauded. Annie's hand slid into hers again, small and warm and trusting. What happens now? Lena asked. Mercer answered. Now we move slowly. Paperwork, meetings, a school evaluation for Annie, a professional dance assessment, financial structures that protect the child, not the donor's ego. And we see whether all parties still want this when it stops being dramatic and starts being work. Annie leaned her head lightly against Lena's arm. I like work, she said. Lena kissed the top of her head. I know you do. Charles stood then. I will have my office contact you with times for the school and dance evaluations. You will meet the instructors before anything is decided. If you don't like them, we find others. Lena looked up at him. You're not used to people saying no to you, are you? No, he said. But I am learning. She held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded once. All right, she said. We'll see. It was not gratitude. It was not trust. But it was not refusal. And for now, in that quiet studio with the mirrors and the old piano and the late afternoon light falling across a scuffed wooden floor, that was enough to keep the door open. The first evaluation was held in a dance studio that smelled faintly of resin, old wood, and effort. Annie stood near the center of the floor in her blue dress again, though Lena had almost chosen something else that morning. In the end, Annie had insisted. This is my dancing dress now, she had said, and Lena had not had the heart to argue with, the way she said it, not proud, not spoiled, just certain. The instructor, a tall woman in her late 30s named Caroline Pierce, watched Annie with a kind of professional stillness that made Lena more nervous than open excitement would have. Caroline did not smile too much. She did not crouch and talk in a baby voice. She did not look at Annie like a charity case. She looked at her like work. That's good, Margaret had said when Lena told her about the appointment. You don't want someone who thinks your kid is adorable. You want someone who thinks your kid is serious. Now Caroline clapped her hands once, lightly. All right, Annie. I'm not going to teach you anything yet. I just want to see how you move when you hear music. Can you do that for me? Annie nodded. Charles and Judge Mercer sat in folding chairs against the wall, not speaking. Lena sat a little apart from them. Her hands locked together so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. She still was not used to being in rooms where people discussed her daughter's future like it was a project with steps and timelines. Caroline walked to the small speaker, pressed a button, and a slow waltz filled the room. Whenever you're ready, she said. Annie did not start immediately. She listened first. That was the first thing Caroline noticed. Again, the child did not rush to be impressive. She waited for the music to settle into her, the way some children waited for bathwater to warm before stepping in. Then Annie moved. One step, then another. A turn that was not technically correct but somehow balanced anyway. Her arms lifted slightly, not in a trained frame, but as if they understood they were supposed to float. Caroline did not interrupt. She watched Annie's feet, then her hips, then her shoulders, then her face. Most children looked at the mirror when they danced. Annie did not. She looked slightly past everything, as if the music were somewhere just beyond the room. After about a minute, Caroline stopped the music. She walked back slowly and crouched in front of Annie. Who showed you how to do that? She asked. Annie shook her head. Nobody. You've never taken a class? No, ma'am. Caroline studied her for another long moment, then stood and turned toward the adults. She has natural timing, she said. That can't really be taught. Balance can be taught. Posture can be taught. Technique can be taught. But musical timing like that, that's either there or it isn't. Lena's stomach tightened. She did not know whether she was supposed to feel proud or afraid when people talked about her child like that. Charles spoke for the first time since the music started. What would she need? Caroline did not answer immediately. She looked back at Annie, who was now standing very still, listening as if her future were being decided in a language she did not fully speak. She needs training, Caroline said finally. Proper training, several days a week. She needs academic schooling that can work around that schedule. She needs nutrition, rest, medical supervision for growth and joint health. And she needs to not be turned into a performing animal before she understands what she's doing. Lena liked her immediately for that last sentence. Caroline continued. And she needs a childhood. If you take that away, the dance will go with it. Mercer nodded. That aligns with what I expected. Charles looked at Annie again. Do you want to do this, Annie? It will be a lot of work. Annie nodded. I like work. Caroline smiled slightly at that, the first real smile she had allowed. Yes, she said, almost to herself. You probably do. After the evaluation, Caroline spoke privately with Lena near the mirrors. I want to be clear about something, she said. Talent like your daughter's attracts attention. Attention attracts people who want something. My job is to teach her to dance, not to sell her story. If at any point this becomes more about publicity than about her development, I walk away. And you should too. Lena held her gaze. You're the first person who said that without smiling. I'm not here to smile, Caroline replied. I'm here to build dancers. When they left the studio that afternoon, Annie was quiet again, holding Lena's hand with both of hers. What are you thinking? Lena asked. Annie looked up. She wasn't looking at my dress. No, Lena said. She wasn't. She was looking at my feet. Yes. Annie seemed pleased with that. Over the next 2 weeks, things began to change in ways Lena had not expected and did not entirely trust. A meeting at Annie's potential new school, a small private academy that had scholarship programs for arts students. Annie took reading and math assessments with a seriousness that made the teacher blink more than once. A doctor's appointment arranged through Mercer's office to check Annie's joints, growth, and general health. Forms, papers, conversations that used words like trust, sponsorship, guardianship framework, and long-term planning. Everything was slow, careful, written down. Charles attended most meetings but did not dominate them. He listened more than Lena expected. Sometimes he asked questions that made it clear he was used to solving problems with money and had to keep reminding himself that this situation was made of people, not numbers. Victor Hale appeared at exactly 2 of the early meetings and spoke often about narrative, public interest, and inspiration. Lena did not like him. Caroline did not like him either, which Lena considered confirmation of her own instincts. One afternoon, after Victor left a meeting, Caroline said bluntly, if that man ever tries to put Annie on a stage before she's ready because it would make a good story, you call me, and I will personally lock the studio doors. Lena believed she meant it. At home, life was both the same and completely different. Annie still did homework at the kitchen table. Lena still worked long shifts, though not always in the same areas of the hotel now. Mrs. Alvarez still watched Annie in the afternoons and sent her home with extra tortillas wrapped in foil. The radiator still banged at night like an old man complaining about winter. But Annie had dance classes now. Real ones. She learned where to place her hands, how to turn without losing balance, how to count music out loud, how to stand straight even when she was tired. She fell sometimes. She got frustrated. Once she came home and cried because her feet hurt. Lena held her and asked, do you want to stop? Annie shook her head into her shoulder. No, I just want my feet to learn faster. That was when Lena understood that whatever door had opened in that ballroom was not a fairy tale. It was work. Hard, daily, often painful work. One evening, about 3 weeks after the gala, Charles came to the studio during the last 10 minutes of Annie's lesson. He stood near the wall, watching quietly, while Annie practiced a simple turn again and again under Caroline's instruction. When the lesson ended, Annie ran to get her coat, and Lena approached Charles. You keep showing up, she said. Yes. Why? He considered the question. Because it is easy to make a promise when a room is watching, he said. It is harder to keep one when no one is. Lena studied his face for a long moment. And which one are you doing now? He met her eyes. I am trying to keep it. Across the room, Annie laughed at something Caroline said. The sound was clear and young and completely unaware of how much the adults around her were trying to build a future sturdy enough to hold it. Lena looked at her daughter, then back at Charles. This doesn't make you her father, she said quietly. I know. This doesn't make us charity. I know. And if this ever turns into something where people look at her and see a story instead of a child, I will take her and disappear so fast you'll think we were never here. Charles nodded once. That is exactly what you should do. For the first time since the ballroom, Lena believed that he understood the rules of this arrangement. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to continue. Across the studio, Annie spun once more in her blue dress, stopped, and looked at herself in the mirror. Then she said, very softly, mostly to her own reflection, I'm going to dance on big stages one day. Lena heard it. So did Charles. Neither of them told her that big stages came with big prices. Some lessons, Lena knew, arrived only when the music changed. The first time Annie performed in front of a small audience again, it was not in a ballroom. It was in a community recital room with folding chairs, a slightly crooked stage, and a piano that sounded a little too loud in the high notes. Parents filled most of the seats, along with a few older couples who supported the arts program and came to every student recital whether they knew the children or not. The air smelled faintly of hairspray, coffee, and nervousness. Annie stood backstage in a simple white practice dress Caroline had chosen for all the beginner students. Her hair was pulled back neatly. Her shoes were new, now soft, proper dance shoes that still looked too clean to Lena, as if they had not yet earned the right to belong to her child. "Remember," Caroline said, crouching in front of her, "this is not about being perfect. This is about listening and finishing what you start. If you make a mistake, keep going. The audience doesn't matter. The music matters." Annie nodded. "Tell me the count," Caroline said. 1, 2, 3, Annie answered. Again, 1, 2, 3. Caroline nodded once and stood. "Good girl. Now go stand on your mark." Lena sat in the third row, hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her fingers had gone numb. Margaret sat beside her, wearing her best sweater and looking as if she were attending something at Carnegie Hall instead of a neighborhood recital. "I'm more nervous than the kid," Margaret muttered. "I can't breathe," Lena whispered. "You are breathing. You're just doing it ugly." On the other side of the aisle, Charles Whitmore sat in a dark suit, alone. Not in the front row, but not hidden either. He had arrived quietly, nodded to Lena, and taken his seat without drawing attention. Most people in the room did not know who he was. Here, he was just another well-dressed man waiting for a child to dance. The recital began. One by one, children walked onto the stage. Some confident, some terrified, some counting out loud under their breath. Parents clapped too loudly. Teachers smiled too much. A few children forgot steps and froze, then hurried off stage in tears while mothers hugged them and said it was all right. Then Annie's name was called. Annie Bell. Lena's heart slammed so hard she felt it in her throat. Annie walked onto the stage, small and straight-backed, and took her place in the center. The lights were not bright like the ballroom, but they were bright enough that Lena could see her daughter's face clearly. Serious, listening, ready. The music began. 1, 2, 3, Annie moved. She was still small, still learning. Her arms were not perfect yet. One turn came a fraction too early. One step landed a little too heavy. But she did not stop. She did not look at the audience. She did exactly what Caroline had told her to do. She listened, and she finished what she started. By the time the music ended, the room was quiet for half a second before applause began. Not thunderous, not astonished, just warm, genuine applause for a child who had done something difficult and done it with heart. Lena wiped her eyes quickly before Annie could see. Margaret leaned over and whispered, "That's how it starts." Charles did not clap the loudest, but he did not clap politely either. He clapped like someone who had invested in something and was watching it grow exactly the way he had hoped. After the recital, Annie ran straight into Lena's arms. "I didn't fall," she said. Lena laughed through tears. "No, you didn't. Did you see the turn?" "I saw everything." Margaret hugged her next. "You were better than half the adults I've seen at weddings." Annie grinned. Charles approached last, giving them space before stepping closer. "You kept going," he said to Annie. Caroline, who had come up behind him, nodded. "That's the first real lesson. Talent is nice. Not stopping is better." They walked out into the cool evening together, the streetlights just beginning to glow. Annie skipped a little ahead, still half dancing as she moved, her white dress catching the light. Caroline turned to Lena. "She'll be ready for more advanced training within a year if she keeps working like this." Lena nodded slowly. "We'll keep working." Charles walked beside them in silence for a few steps, then said, "There will be invitations soon." Lena looked at him. Invitations. Small performances, youth showcases, donor events. People will want to see her. Lena's expression hardened immediately. "No donor events." Caroline spoke before Charles could answer. "No donor events," she agreed firmly. "Not for a long time. Stage experience, yes. Being paraded around rich people who want to feel generous, no." Charles nodded once. "Agreed." Lena looked between them. "You two planned that answer." Caroline allowed herself a small smile. "We discussed it." They reached the corner where they would part ways. Annie came back and took Lena's hand again. "Mama, did I look like a real dancer?" Lena bent down and touched her cheek. You are a real dancer. You're just a small one right now. Annie seemed satisfied with that. That night, after Annie was asleep, Lena sat at the kitchen table again, the same place she had sat the night of the gala. The same lamp, the same chipped mug full of crayons, the same stack of bills, but now there was also a recital program on the table with Annie's name printed in plain black letters. Annie Bell. It looked both ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. Lena heard a knock on the door around 9. When she opened it, she was surprised to see Charles standing in the hallway alone. No driver, no assistant, just a coat, and the tired look of a man who had worked a long day. I'm sorry, he said. I should have called. I was nearby and wanted to drop something off. Lena hesitated, then stepped aside so he could enter. He looked around the apartment once, not with judgment, but with attention, as if trying to understand where Annie's real life lived when she was not in studios and recitals. He placed a thin envelope on the table. What is that? Lena asked. Paperwork from the Education Trust, he said. Mercer asked me to bring it so you wouldn't feel pressure to come downtown again this week. Read it slowly. With him, not alone. Lena nodded but did not touch the envelope yet. Charles looked toward the small bedroom alcove where Annie slept. She did well tonight. Yes, Lena said. She did. He was quiet for a moment, then said something he had not said before. I grew up with money, he said, but not with anyone who noticed whether I was good at anything. They noticed whether I was useful. There is a difference. Lena studied him carefully. Is that why you stopped when you saw her dancing? Yes, he said. Because no one stopped for me when I was a child. And I have spent most of my life surrounded by people who would step over a gifted child if she was standing in the wrong doorway. Lena leaned against the table, folding her arms. Helping her won't fix whatever happened to you. I know, he said. That is not why I am doing it. She held his gaze a long moment, then nodded once toward the envelope. If this ever turns into something where she owes you for her life, we're gone, Charles answered without hesitation. She does not owe me her life. She owes herself her work. That is all. That was the first time Lena believed he understood the most important rule. After he left, she sat at the table for a long time looking at the envelope, at Annie's recital program, at the small apartment around her that had held every version of their life so far. In the next room, Annie turned in her sleep and murmured something that sounded like counting. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Lena sat there listening to that soft counting in the dark and understood something she had not fully understood before. The dance had never really been about the ballroom, or the billionaire, or the promise. It had always been about whether a child with a gift would be given a fair chance to keep it. And that, Lena knew, was a much harder fight than one waltz under a chandelier. The letter from the school arrived on a Thursday afternoon, folded into a clean white envelope with Annie's name printed carefully across the front. Lena did not open it right away. She placed it on the kitchen table, next to the recital program and the envelope from the Education Trust that she still read in small pieces every night after Annie fell asleep. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a television in the next unit. Annie was on the floor with her math workbook, her pencil moving slowly as she counted under her breath. What's that? Annie asked, looking at the envelope. School letter, Lena said. Good or bad? I don't know yet. Open it, Annie said. Lena sat down, slid her finger carefully under the flap, and pulled out the letter. She read it once silently, then again more slowly, making sure she had not misunderstood the words. What does it say? Annie asked. Lena looked up. It says you got in, she said. Annie blinked. Got in where? The academy, the new school. Annie stared at her as if the words had not quite landed. The big school? With the dance room? Yes. And the library with the tall shelves? Yes. And the lunchroom with the windows? Lena smiled a little. Yes. Annie was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked, very seriously, can we still afford the bus? Lena laughed before she could stop herself, a laugh that turned into something else halfway through. She pulled Annie into her arms and held her tightly. We're going to figure everything out, she said, one step at a time. The next few weeks became a schedule Lena had never imagined for her child. School in the morning, dance in the afternoon, homework at the kitchen table, dinner, stretching exercises Caroline insisted Annie do every night so her body would learn safely. Lena worked earlier shifts now, thanks partly to Denise and partly to the fact that Charles's foundation had quietly arranged a supplemental housing stipend through the Education Trust. Lena had not moved yet. but the pressure of rent had loosened just enough that she could breathe between paychecks instead of constantly ahead of them. One evening, after Annie finished her stretching and fell asleep on the couch with her math book still open, Lena sat at the table going over the trust documents again. She still did not trust anything she did not understand, and she made Mercer explain every paragraph in plain language, sometimes twice. There was a knock on the door around 8. When Lena opened it, she found Victor Hale standing in the hallway, holding a polite smile and a leather folder. "I was hoping we could talk," he said. Lena did not open the door wider. "Mr. Whitmore usually calls first. This isn't about Charles directly," Victor said smoothly. "It's about opportunity. I'm not interested in opportunity that shows up unannounced." Victor kept his smile. "May I come in for 5 minutes?" Lena hesitated, then stepped aside just enough. 5. Victor walked in, glanced once around the apartment the way people did when they were trying to understand a life very different from their own, then sat at the table without being asked. He placed the folder in front of him and opened it. "There has been a great deal of media interest," he said. "A major morning show wants to feature Annie's story. A magazine is offering a profile piece. There is talk of a televised youth arts segment. This could open enormous doors for her." Lena crossed her arms. "No." Victor blinked, surprised by the speed of the answer. "You haven't even heard the details." "I heard enough. This is how careers are built now," Victor continued. "Visibility, narrative, public interest. People fall in love with a story before they fall in love with a performer." "My daughter is not a story," Lena said. Victor leaned forward slightly. "With respect, Miss Bell, she already is. You can either control that story or let the world tell it without you." Lena felt anger rise, slow and steady. "You mean let you tell it? I mean protect her future. She's 6. And 6-year-olds with this kind of natural ability do not stay anonymous for long." Lena looked at the folder but did not touch it. "What does Charles say about this?" Victor paused just a fraction too long. "Charles is emotionally invested. I handle practical matters." That was all Lena needed to hear. "You can take your practical matters and leave," she said. Victor's smile thinned. "You are making this harder than it needs to be." "No," Lena replied quietly. "I am making it slower than you want it to be." At that moment, Annie stirred on the couch, half waking. "Mama, I'm here, baby," Lena said, without looking away from Victor. Annie sat up, rubbing her eyes. She saw Victor and frowned slightly. "You're the man from the ballroom." Victor's smile returned instantly. "Yes, Annie. I help Mr. Whitmore with important decisions." Annie studied him for a long second in that unnervingly direct way she had. "Are you helping me dance?" she asked. Victor blinked. "In a way, yes." Annie shook her head. "Miss Caroline helps me dance. Mama helps me. Mr. Whitmore helps me go to school. The judge helps with papers." She paused. "I don't know what you help with." Lena turned her head slightly so Victor would not see the corner of her mouth move. Victor closed the folder slowly. "I help make sure the world notices," he said. Annie thought about that. "Why?" "So that important people can support you." Annie looked at him for another long moment, then said something that made the room very quiet. "The music notices me already," she said. "I don't need important people to notice me yet." Victor did not have an answer ready for that. Lena walked to the door and opened it. "Your 5 minutes are over." Victor stood, collected his folder, and paused before leaving. "This opportunity will not wait forever." Lena met his eyes. "My daughter is not milk. She does not expire." After he left, Annie looked up at her mother. "Was he mad?" "Yes," Lena said. "Are you mad?" "Yes." "Is Mr. Whitmore going to be mad?" Lena hesitated. "I don't know." The phone rang less than 10 minutes later. Lena picked up. "Hello?" Charles's voice came through, calm as always. "Victor came to see you." "Yes." "And you said no." "Yes." There was a pause. Then Charles said, "Good." Lena blinked. "Good?" "He works for me," Charles said. "But he does not decide who Annie becomes." Lena sat down slowly. Annie climbed off the couch and came to stand beside her, listening to only one side of the conversation. "He said this is how careers are built now," Lena said. "He is not entirely wrong," Charles replied. "But he is not entirely right either. There is a difference between building a career and selling a childhood." Lena felt something in her chest loosen that she had not realized was tight. "I told him no donor events," she said. "Yes." "No television?" "Yes." No magazine stories. Yes. She waited. For now. Charles added. Lena nodded slowly. For now. Annie tugged lightly on her sleeve. Is that Mr. Whitmore? Yes. Tell him I got into the school. Annie whispered. Lena handed her the phone. Hello? Annie said. Hello, Annie. I got into the big school. I heard. I am very proud of you. I'm going to work very hard, Annie said. I know you will. There was a small pause. Then Annie asked, Are you still going to keep your promise? Charles did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter than Lena had ever heard it. Yes, he said, I am. Annie nodded, though he could not see it. Okay, she said, and handed the phone back to Lena. After the call ended, Lena sat for a long time in the quiet apartment, Annie leaning against her side, the acceptance letter still on the table. The world had begun to notice. Opportunities were beginning to circle. People with plans were beginning to appear. And Lena understood now that the hardest part of this journey would not be the dancing. It would be protecting the child who danced from the world that always came looking when someone special appeared. Annie's first day at the new school began with a uniform that still felt like a costume. The skirt was navy blue, the shirt white, the sweater soft and new in a way that made Lena nervous because new things always felt like they could be taken away. Annie stood in front of the small mirror in their apartment, turning slightly from side to side, not admiring herself, just getting used to the way the clothes moved. Do I look like I belong there? She asked. Lena walked up behind her and straightened the collar. You belong anywhere you're willing to work for. That's not what I asked. Lena met her eyes in the mirror. You look like a girl who is going to school. Annie accepted that answer and picked up her backpack, which was still stiff and empty enough that it did not yet look like it belonged to a real student. The academy building was tall, old, and built from a kind of stone that made everything look serious. Inside, the floors shone and the walls were lined with photographs of graduating classes, debate teams, science awards, and art showcases. Annie walked beside Lena quietly, her hand wrapped around two of Lena's fingers instead of the whole hand the way she used to when she was smaller. In the admissions office, a woman with silver glasses and a calm voice welcomed them. You must be Annie, she said. Yes, ma'am. We're very happy you're here. Annie nodded, unsure what the correct response to that was. The woman turned to Lena. Your daughter tested very well, especially in reading. And her math is strong for her age. Lena felt a small, private pride rise in her chest. They had done that at the kitchen table together, night after night, long before any billionaire had entered their lives. Her schedule will be slightly different from most students, the woman continued. Academic classes in the morning, then she will leave early 3 days a week for dance training. We've coordinated with her instructor. Lena nodded. Everything was organized, structured, planned. It still felt like stepping onto a floor she did not know how to walk on. Annie's classroom smelled like pencils and paper and floor polish. Children were already sitting at desks in neat rows, some talking, some reading, some watching the door the way children did when someone new was about to enter. When Annie walked in, the room went a little quiet. This was a different kind of stage, Lena realized. No music, no pretty dress, no applause waiting at the end. Just desks, books, and other children trying to figure out where she fit. The teacher, Mr. Howard, smiled and put a hand lightly on Annie's shoulder. Class, this is Annie Bell. She's joining us this term. A few children said hello. One girl smiled. A boy in the back kept staring at Annie's shoes. You can sit here, Mr. Howard said, guiding her to an empty desk near the middle. Lena watched from the doorway for a moment longer than she should have, then forced herself to leave. Letting go in small ways was part of this new life, too. The first few weeks were not easy. The schoolwork was harder. The expectations were higher. Some children were friendly. Some were curious in a way that felt like questions they did not ask out loud. One afternoon, Annie came home quieter than usual and pushed her food around her plate without eating much. What happened? Lena asked. Nothing. That's not an answer. Annie kept looking at her plate. A girl asked me if I was the charity student. Lena felt something hot and sharp move through her chest. What did you say? I said I was the dance student. Lena reached across the table and took her hand. That was the right answer. Annie looked up. Is it true? Yes, Lena said. It's true. At the studio, training became more serious. Caroline no longer let Annie just move the way she felt. Now there were exercises, Repetition, corrections. Again, Caroline would say. Again, again. Sometimes Annie's eyes filled with tears when her body would not do what the music asked. One afternoon, after Annie had stumbled through the same turn 5 times, she stopped and said, frustrated, "But I can hear it right. Why can't my feet do it right?" Caroline knelt in front of her. Because hearing and doing are 2 different skills. Talent is when you hear it. Discipline is when you make your body obey what you hear. Annie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. So I have to learn discipline. Yes, Caroline said. Every great dancer does. Annie nodded. Okay. Again, Caroline glanced at Lena across the room. She's going to be all right, she said quietly. Lena watched her daughter go back to the starting position. Small shoulders, straight, face serious again. I know, Lena said. I'm just trying to keep up with her. Charles came to the studio less often now. But when he did, he watched the same way he always had, quiet, focused, as if he were trying to memorize something that might disappear if he looked away. One evening, as Annie packed her dance shoes into her bag, Charles spoke to Lena near the door. The board is pushing again, he said. About what? Public appearances, interviews. They say interest is growing. They want the foundation associated with her early. Lena's jaw tightened. No, I know. Do you? Yes, he said. But saying no to donors is more complicated than saying no to Victor. Lena crossed her arms. Then maybe donors need to hear no more often. He looked at her for a long moment. You don't know how rare it is for someone to say that to me. That's because most people need something from you. And you don't? Lena met his eyes. I need you to keep your word. That's all. He nodded once. I'm trying. Weeks turned into months. Annie grew stronger. Her turns became cleaner, her posture straighter, her confidence quieter and deeper. No longer the bright excitement of a child who had discovered something new, but the steady focus of someone who had chosen something hard. One night, after a long day of school and dance, Annie fell asleep at the table again, her head resting on her homework. Lena carried her to bed, covered her with the quilt, and stood there for a long time watching her sleep. Children looked the same when they slept, no matter where they came from. Rich, poor, loved, overlooked, gifted, ordinary. Sleeping children all looked like hope if anyone was willing to protect it. Lena went back into the kitchen and found the acceptance letter, the recital program, and the trust papers still in the same drawer where she kept the important things. She added one more item that night, Annie's first report card from the academy. Good grades. Teacher's note. Annie is quiet but very determined. She works harder than most students her age. Lena sat down at the table and allowed herself, for the first time since the ballroom, to imagine something she had been too afraid to imagine before. Not fame, not money, not big stages. Just a future where Annie could become everything she was capable of becoming without the world breaking her on the way there. In the next room, Annie turned in her sleep and whispered something again. The same words she always seemed to whisper now. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Lena sat in the quiet apartment, listening to that soft counting, and understood that their life was now measured in different steps. Not by paychecks, not by rent deadlines, not by how long groceries could stretch, but by school terms, dance lessons, and the slow, careful keeping of a promise that had begun with a waltz. Winter came quietly that year, the way it often did in the city, first in the early darkness, then in the sharp air that slipped through coat sleeves, and finally in the thin layer of ice that formed along the sidewalks in the morning. Annie walked to school beside Lena, with her scarf wrapped twice around her neck and her dance bag bumping lightly against her hip. She had grown in the past few months, not just taller, but steadier. She no longer looked around as much when they entered new places. She walked in, looked once, and then paid attention to what she had come there to do. At school, she was still quiet, but no longer invisible. Her teacher, Mr. Howard, stopped Lena one morning during drop-off. She's doing very well, he said, especially in reading comprehension, and she's very disciplined for her age. She likes to finish things, Lena said. Yes, he replied. I've noticed. Not all children do. On the playground, Annie had begun to make 2 friends. Lily, who liked books and talked a lot, and Marcus, who liked numbers and asked Annie endless questions about dancing. Do you spin because you don't get dizzy? Marcus asked one afternoon. Or do you not get dizzy because you spin? Annie thought about that seriously. I pick a spot and look at it every time I turn. Miss Caroline says that's how you don't get lost. Marcus nodded as if this were very important scientific information. But not everything at school was easy. One day, Annie came home with a small tear in the knee of her uniform and a quiet look on her face. What happened? Lena asked. I fell at recess, Annie said. Lena knelt and looked at the tear. It was not a bad fall. But Annie was too careful a child to tear her uniform easily. Did someone push you? Lena asked gently. Annie hesitated. Some boys were running and said I was in the way. One of them said I should go back to the school I came from. Lena felt that hot, familiar anger again, the kind that came from years of swallowing things she could not afford to fight. And what did you say? Lena asked. I said I am in the school I came from. I just came from a different place before. Lena pulled her into a hug. That was a good answer. But that night, after Annie was asleep, Lena sat at the table thinking about how success did not protect children from cruelty. Sometimes it invited it. At the studio, training had moved into a new phase. Caroline began pairing Annie with another student, a boy named Daniel who was 2 years older and already very precise with his steps. At first, Annie was nervous dancing with a partner. It was different from dancing alone. You had to trust someone else's timing, someone else's balance. Don't look at his feet, Caroline told her. Feel the lead through the hand. Dancing with a partner is a conversation. You don't talk over each other. You listen. Annie nodded seriously. Like when Mama is tired and I wait until she finishes talking before I ask for something. Caroline smiled. Exactly like that. They practiced the waltz again. The same dance that had changed everything. But now, it was slower, more technical, more exact. Annie had to relearn steps she thought she already knew. Sometimes that frustrated her more than learning something new. One afternoon she said, "It was easier when I didn't know the rules." Caroline nodded. It always is. But the rules give you the power to choose what to break later. Annie thought about that for a long time. Charles continued to keep his distance in some ways and stay very present in others. He did not come to every lesson, but the trust paid for them. He did not call every day. But when there was a school meeting, a medical appointment, or a performance, he was there. Not in the front row like a proud father. Not hidden, like a secret. Just there, watching, making sure the path he had promised was still clear. One evening, after a long practice, Annie sat on the studio floor pulling off her dance shoes while Lena and Charles spoke quietly near the door. She's improving faster now, Charles said. Yes, Lena replied. But it's getting harder too. It will keep getting harder. I know. They stood in silence for a moment, watching Annie laugh at something Daniel said while they packed their bags. Victor is still pushing, Charles said finally. For what? A televised youth showcase. He says it would establish her early. Lena didn't even look at him. No. I told him no. And he listened? Charles gave a small, humorless smile. Victor listens. He just doesn't stop. Lena crossed her arms. You said I decide what happens to her. You do. Then it's still no. Charles nodded. All right. Annie ran over then, her coat half on, her hair slightly messy from practice. Mama. Miss Caroline says I might be ready for the spring showcase. Lena smiled. That's good. It's a real stage, Annie said. With lights, Charles looked at her. Are you nervous? Annie thought about it. A little. But I like the part right before the music starts. What part is that? He asked. When everything is quiet and you know you're about to begin, Annie said. It feels like standing at the edge of something. Charles nodded slowly. Yes, he said. It does. That night, after Annie fell asleep, Lena sat by the window for a long time, looking out at the streetlights and the people hurrying home in the cold. Their life was still small in many ways. The same apartment, the same bus routes, the same secondhand furniture. But Annie now carried a dance bag and school books that could lead her somewhere Lena had never been. The phone rang around 9. It was Judge Mercer. I wanted to inform you, he said, that the trust is now fully secured. Legally, the funds cannot be withdrawn, redirected, or used for publicity without your written consent. Lena closed her eyes in relief. Thank you. There is something else, Mercer added. Mr. Whitmore has refused 2 major donor proposals tied to Annie appearing publicly. Lena was quiet for a moment. That probably cost him. Yes, Mercer said. It did. After the call, Lena sat in the quiet apartment and thought about that. About promises. about money, about power, about a man who had everything and was, for reasons she still did not fully understand, choosing to spend some of it protecting a little girl who had walked into a ballroom from a service hallway. In the next room, Annie turned in her sleep again, and Lena heard the familiar whisper, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Lena leaned her head back against the wall and closed her eyes. The world was still complicated. People were still dangerous. Nothing was guaranteed. But the promise was still holding, and Annie was still dancing. The spring showcase arrived on a warm evening that smelled like dust, stage paint, and nerves. Backstage, children in costumes moved in careful lines while teachers adjusted hems, fixed hair, and reminded everyone to breathe. Annie stood near the side curtain in a pale blue performance dress Caroline had chosen, simple, soft, and light enough to move like air when she turned. Her hair was pulled back into a smooth bun, and her new dance shoes were no longer too clean. They had been worn, stretched, broken in by hours of practice. They belonged to her now. Remember, Caroline said, kneeling in front of her. This stage is bigger. The lights are brighter, and the audience will be very quiet. That can feel scary, but it's still just music. Nothing else changes. Annie nodded. Listen and finish. Caroline smiled. Exactly. From behind the curtain, Annie could hear the audience settling into their seats. Programs rustled. Someone coughed. A chair scraped softly across the floor. That sound, the sound of people waiting, was becoming familiar to her now. Lena sat in the audience near the aisle, hands folded together so tightly they hurt. Margaret sat beside her again, wearing the same good sweater she wore to every important thing Annie did. On Lena's other side sat Charles, quiet as always, his attention fixed on the stage as if the rest of the room did not exist. You all right? Margaret whispered. No, Lena said. You're never all right before she goes on. I don't think I ever will be. Margaret patted her hand. That's because you know what it costs. The lights dimmed slightly, and the announcer stepped onto the stage. The next performance, she said, is a student waltz. Annie Bell and Daniel Reeves. Lena stopped breathing. The music began softly, and Annie stepped onto the stage with Daniel beside her. The lights were bright enough that Annie could not see individual faces, only shapes and shadows, and the soft glow of the front rows. For 1 second, the size of the stage felt too big. The air felt too wide. The silence felt too loud. Then, she heard the count. 1, 2, 3, and everything became smaller again. She moved with Daniel the way Caroline had taught her, listening through her hand, feeling the lead, keeping her shoulders soft, her steps clean, her turns controlled. She did not rush. She did not try to be impressive. She did exactly what she had practiced, exactly what the music asked. Halfway through the dance, she made a small mistake. Her foot landed a fraction off the line, and for a split second she felt the old fear rise, the fear of doing something wrong in front of people who were watching. But then she heard Caroline's voice in her head. If you make a mistake, keep going. The audience doesn't matter. The music matters. So she kept going. At the end of the final turn, when the music slowed and Daniel guided her into the last position, Annie lifted her chin slightly the way Caroline had taught her, and held still until the final note ended. The applause came louder this time, not because she was perfect, because she was becoming something. Backstage, Caroline hugged her once, quick and firm. You stayed with the music. That's what matters. I messed up once, Annie said. Yes, Caroline replied, and you did not fall apart. That's called being a dancer. When Annie came out to the lobby afterward, Lena hugged her so tightly Annie laughed. Mama, I couldn't breathe. That's because I needed to make sure you were still real, Lena said. Margaret wiped her eyes openly. I don't cry for weddings, but I cry for this child every time. Charles waited until Annie finished talking to Daniel and Caroline before he stepped forward. You looked very calm, he said. I wasn't, Annie answered. That's what calm is, he said, moving anyway. Annie thought about that seriously, then nodded as if she would remember it forever. The ride home that night felt different from every other ride home after a performance. Annie leaned against Lena, half asleep, her head on her mother's shoulder, her dance bag at her feet. Margaret had gone home earlier, and Charles had insisted on driving them himself instead of sending a car. The city lights moved across the windshield in long, quiet lines. After a while, Annie said softly, Mr. Whitmore? Yes? Do you remember the ballroom? Yes. That was the first time I danced in a big room. she said sleepily. But this was the first time I danced on a real stage. Charles glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Yes, he said. It was. Which one counts more? Annie asked. Charles thought for a moment before answering. The one you worked for. Annie seemed satisfied with that answer and fell asleep a few minutes later. When they reached the apartment, Charles carried her up the stairs so she would not wake. Lena watched him carefully as he laid Annie gently on the bed and pulled the quilt over her. Children looked very small when they slept, no matter how big the stage had been a few hours earlier. They stepped quietly back into the kitchen, and Lena poured 2 glasses of water without asking if he wanted one. She's changing, Lena said. Yes, she's growing up faster than I thought she would. That happens when children find something they love. Lena leaned against the counter. Victor came again last week. To the hotel. I told Denise not to let him near me while I'm working. Charles's expression hardened slightly. I will handle Victor. He thinks you're making a mistake, Lena said. He often thinks that when I disagree with him. And are you? Charles looked toward the small bedroom where Annie slept. I don't know, he said. But I know I would have made a worse mistake if I had ignored her that night. Lena studied him for a long moment. You know people are going to say she's only here because of you. Yes. And they're going to say you only help her because it makes you look like a good man. Yes. And they're going to say I let a rich man buy my child's future. Charles did not answer immediately this time. When he did, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. People will say many things, he said. But none of them were in that service hallway. None of them saw her listening to music like it was the only honest thing in the room. And none of them are the ones waking up at night making sure she has what she needs. You are. Lena felt something in her chest tighten and ease at the same time. I am not giving her to you, she said. I know. But you did change her life. Charles shook his head slightly. No, he said. She changed mine. I just had more money to do something about it. They stood in the quiet kitchen for a long moment. 2 adults from completely different worlds connected by a promise neither of them had expected to make. In the next room, Annie turned in her sleep and whispered again, soft and steady. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Lena listened to that sound and realized that the story people would tell about this would probably be wrong. They would say a billionaire saved a poor girl. They would say a lucky child was chosen. They would say it was a miracle in a ballroom. But Lena knew the truth was simpler and harder than that. A child had a gift. A man had the power to open a door. And a mother had decided to stand there and make sure that once the door opened, no one pushed her child through it alone. The letter came almost a year after the night in the ballroom. It arrived in a thick envelope with the logo of a National Youth Arts Foundation printed in the corner. Annie brought it to the kitchen table with both hands like it was something fragile. Mama, this one looks important, she said. Lena dried her hands on a dish towel and sat down. Over the past year, they had received many letters, school reports, recital programs, training schedules, medical checkups, scholarship confirmations, but this envelope was heavier, more formal, the kind that suggested doors opening somewhere far away. Open it, Annie said. You open it, Lena replied. Annie carefully slid her finger under the flap and pulled out the letter. She read slowly now, her reading stronger than it had been a year ago, her voice quiet and careful as she sounded out the formal words. Dear Annie Bell, we are pleased to invite you. National Youth Dance Showcase. Selected students. Performance opportunity. Travel and training scholarship. She stopped and looked up. Mama, what is a national showcase? Lena felt her heart begin to beat faster. It means dancers from all over the country come to perform. Annie blinked. All over? Yes. And they picked me? Lena nodded slowly. Yes, they picked you. Annie sat very still, holding the letter. That sounds big. It is big, Lena said. That evening they took the letter to the studio so Caroline could read it too. Caroline read every line carefully, then looked at Annie with an expression Lena had learned to recognize over the past year. It was the expression Caroline had when Annie reached a new level. Not excitement, not surprise, but recognition. This is real, Caroline said. This is very real. Is it good? Annie asked. Yes, Caroline said. It's good, but it also means more work, more pressure, more people watching. Annie nodded. I can work. Caroline smiled slightly. Yes, you can. Charles met them later that evening in the studio office with Judge Mercer. The four adults sat around the small desk while Annie stretched on the floor nearby, counting quietly to herself as she held each position the way Caroline had taught her. "This will bring attention," Mercer said, reading the letter again. "Press, donors, sponsors, all of them." Lena looked at Charles. "Victor is going to love this." Charles did not smile. "Victor already called me. And I told him nothing changes without Lena's approval." Lena leaned back in her chair, studying him. "You keep saying that, and I keep meaning it." Mercer folded the letter and placed it back on the desk. "If Annie attends this showcase, we need additional legal protection. Image rights, performance contracts, travel guardianship documents. This is where many young performers are exploited if their parents are not protected." Lena nodded. "Then we do it right." Across the room, Annie finished her stretch and walked over. "Am I going to dance on a big stage now?" Caroline answered. "Yes. But remember what I told you. A big stage is just a floor with more people watching. The dance is still the same." Annie looked at the letter again. "Is this because of the ballroom?" All four adults looked at her. Charles answered quietly. "No. This is because of all the days after the ballroom." Annie seemed to think that was the correct answer. In the weeks that followed, life became even more structured. Annie trained more hours, but Caroline was careful. Schoolwork still came first. Rest still mattered. And Annie was still a child who sometimes laughed too loudly at dinner and forgot where she put her math book. One night, about 2 weeks before the showcase, Annie and Lena were walking home from the bus stop when Annie asked a question she had not asked in a long time. "Mama, yes? If I didn't walk into that ballroom, would I still be a dancer?" Lena thought about it carefully before answering. "Yes," she said. "You would still be a dancer. It just might have taken the world longer to notice." Annie held her hand tighter. "I'm glad the music was loud that night." "So am I," Lena said. The night before they were scheduled to leave for the showcase, Charles came by the apartment again. Not in a suit this time, just a coat and tired eyes and a small box in his hand. "I have something for Annie," he said. Annie opened the box on the kitchen table. Inside was a small, simple silver necklace with a tiny charm shaped like a music note. "It's not expensive," Charles said, "but I thought you might wear it when you travel. So you remember something." "Remember what?" Annie asked. He looked at her for a moment before answering. "That no matter how big the stage gets, you started dancing before anyone was watching." Annie picked up the necklace and held it carefully. "Thank you." After Annie went to bed, Lena walked Charles to the door. "She's going farther than I ever imagined," Lena said. "Yes, that scares me." "It should," he said. "Big worlds are not always kind to small, talented children." Lena crossed her arms. "Then we keep walking with her." "Yes," he said. "We do." She looked at him for a long moment. "You kept your promise." He shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "I'm still keeping it." After he left, Lena stood in the quiet apartment and looked at the blue dress hanging near the closet. Annie had outgrown it now. The dress that had taken her into the ballroom no longer fit the girl she was becoming. Lena touched the fabric gently and realized something important. The dress had never been the reason the door opened. The dance had been, the work had been, the courage had been. The next morning, as they left for the train that would take them to the showcase, Annie wore a simple coat, her dance bag over her shoulder, and the small silver music note around her neck. She took Lena's hand as they walked through the station and said, "Mama?" "Yes. When I dance on the big stage, are you going to be scared?" "Yes," Lena said. "Are you still going to watch?" "Yes," Lena said again. Annie smiled. "Okay, then I'm not scared either." Years later, people would tell this story in many different ways. They would say a billionaire changed a little girl's life with a single sentence. They would say a poor child got lucky. They would say it was a fairy tale that began in a ballroom. But the truth was quieter than that. A tired mother had said yes carefully. A powerful man had kept showing up when it stopped being exciting. A strict teacher had demanded discipline instead of praise. And a little girl had listened to music when no one was watching and kept dancing when life became difficult. That was the real story. And it all began with a waltz, a promise, and a child who was brave enough to take one step forward when the whole world was watching. This story teaches us that talent can be found in the most unexpected places, but talent alone is never enough. What truly changes a life is a combination of opportunity, hard work, and people who keep their promises. Annie was not saved by wealth, and she was not chosen because of luck alone. She succeeded because she worked when no one was watching, because her mother protected her with courage and dignity, and because one man with power chose responsibility instead of applause. The lesson is simple but powerful. Real change happens when kindness becomes commitment, when talent meets discipline, and when someone opens a door, but also stays to make sure you can walk through it on your own. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.